Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. And a while ago, you remember I did a video about NYRB classics, SFF hidden in plain sight in a bookshop near you, or maybe not, they're online of course. And today we're going to look at more SF, which again will be hidden in plain sight because it's not marketed and packaged as SF. Instead, we're going to look at Penguin Modern Classics, and I'm going to talk you through just some of the SF they do or have done. There's probably a few things I don't have. I can tell you straight away I don't have The Black Cloud by Fred Hoggs. I'm not that keen on Fred Hoyle, but I'm going to show you a load of other things which you can look out for, because basically a lot of these books will end up shelved with general books in a lot of bookshops because they won't have somebody like me picking them out and being insistent about where they should go in terms of their genre status. And also they're B format books, and they're presented for a literary market, whatever that is. So Penguin, of course, they've done SF for a very long time, of course. I think they started doing it in the 60s, and for years and years and years they did it in the A format. I'll just show you an A and B format book together. There we go. There's an old 1973 A format Seeds of Time by John Wyndham, and a current B format science fiction omnibus by Brian Aldiss. So I'm starting with these just because I bought this the other day. I came across a load of A format Wyndhams in the covered market in Bath, and this one is absolutely spiffing. It's in really beautiful condition. Now I've got another copy of this. I've still got my original, which I bought about the same time, and I love these covers with this lovely line illustration. But this was so nice and it was £2. I wasn't going to leave it for somebody else, I'm afraid, because mine is in a real state, and you rarely see them in this condition. So they did lots of SF like that. But Penguin Modern Classics, I don't know when Penguin Modern Classics started. I think it started in the 1960s. Now in the USA, there's only Penguin Classics, which have a black livery. There's no Penguin Modern Classics. Penguin Modern Classics started in the 60s in the UK, again as an A format imprint. And the basic idea was that it would represent books from the modern canon. And we don't mean contemporary by that, we mean the modernist canon. And the dividing line until about 1986 was that anything the Penguin did as a classic, if it was published after the year 1900, it was a modern classic. If it was published before, it was a black classic. And the way that worked was that you'd have authors like, say, H.G. Wells, and some of their books would be modern classics and some of them would be black classics. Now, of course, the term classics is incorrect when applied to fiction from the last 200 years anyway. Classic strictly means Greek and Roman works of a certain vintage, but it's become a thing with the classic novel of character, class and social mores of the 18th and 19th century, particularly the 19th century. So when people say classics now, they're often talking about 19th century novels, and bookshops don't help. And it's the same where I work, because we have classics, or we should say classic fiction, as opposed to classics, meaning Greek and Roman works, which are often, 2,000 years old or older, or a little bit newer, up to about 500 AD, I would say. So if you go through the general fiction shelves in a big bookshop, you will come across lots of modern classics, and the modern classics livery changes. It changes about every 5 to 10 years. This is a current one, as you see. It's got a white spine. Some of them have had silver spine. Some of them have had greens. They vary because, of course, Penguin have to keep the art department in their jobs. That's the only reason I can see for it. That's a strange thing about book covers. If you think about music, if you think about cultural production, the only elements of cultural production which are anywhere near like books is recorded music, albums. So when you buy an album, say Pink Floyd, that's the same cover now as it did in the 70s. And because it's iconographic, why do we need to change books? Things are off their time. They need to be updated. And yet loads of young people buy old records. So go figure. But anyway, here's a typical example. And this is a science fiction omnibus edited by Brian Aldis. Brian, of course, is dead now, died a few years back, and this has gone through various editions and he used to update it fairly regularly. And I looked through this recently and reread some of it because I was offered the chance to teach an online science fiction course, which I declined purely because of my health problems, and with running this channel and working, I just don't have the time, though I may do it in future. So I did it so I keep making videos for you guys, but it was a nice offer, and I might go back to that, but I just couldn't do all those things. I couldn't sort of cope with it all. So, but I was looking over this and thinking, would I use this to teach from? And it was one option, because I thought if I'm going to teach a little course, I really want to go from a anthology, and this isn't bad, but I would have gone for the Oxford Book of Science Fiction Stories instead, edited by Tom Shippey, which I think is a better overview. This is quite sort of quirky and idiosyncratic. There's all sorts of stuff in it. I mean, Brian used to have his quirky and idiosyncratic moments, but there's people like Ward Moore, Simak, James Tiptree Jr., Aldis himself, James M. Schmitz, Catherine McLean, you never hear anything about, Bruce Sterling. I reread Swarm in this, which I really liked, and funnily enough, that's in the Oxford one as well. Greg Bear's Blood Music, the short version, all sorts of stuff. It's great stuff. There's also oddities, like there's an SF story by John Steinbeck in here. So this is what you're looking out for at the moment. So when you see a load of Penguin Modern Classics, take a close look at them, because some of them are SF, okay? So we'll just run through a few here now. I'm going to go through all the ones I have. I might have missed a couple, but I tried to pull them all together. This is the Arc Sakura by Kobo Abe, who was a Japanese novelist, very interesting Japanese novelist. He played around with genre forms. He wrote the first full-length Japanese SF novel, which is a book called Inter Ice Age 4, which I've got, which I've never seen a paperback of. There has been a paperback, I think, in the States, and it really needs reissuing, and that was in the 50s. This is a book from the 60s. The Arc Sakura, and as you see, this has got like a nice, gentle minty green, and this is in a mini series within Modern Classics, which is a series of Japanese fiction, Penguin Japanese classics, and they did about 6 of these last year. And the Arc Sakura has also been done in an A format in the Penguin Classic Science Fiction series, which are white and purple, and it is absolutely nuts. All I can say, it's about somebody who is kind of a recluse, and they're called the Mole, and they live in this strange sort of city, and he hides in a bunker, and there's all sorts of weird stuff going on there. There's like a maze, and there's a gigantic toilet in there. You know, it really is really strange. But Abe was a strange guy, but very interesting. He did a book called Woman in the Dunes, which is his most famous book. There's a wonderful metaphysical thriller called The Ruined Map. And there's a very odd surrealist novel about a guy called, The Boxman is the novel is called, but a guy who walks around with a cardboard box on his head. So if you're up for some high strangeness, go for the Arc Sakura. Then, you know, an all-time modern classic SF novel, which is in Penguin Modern Classics. Again, this is a current edition. I've got, I think, about 3 copies of this book. Is Hot House by Brian Aldis, which is one of the most creative books you'll ever read. Absolutely wonderful. And it's in lots of ways, it's more like fantasy. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that in the far future, Earth has stopped revolving. Plants have taken over. They've merged with animals in some cases, and mankind has shrunk and has now got green skin to photosynthesize and lives in the trees. And it's about one of these little green men who falls out of his tree, so you can see already, and he goes on a quest. And it's really, really linguistically inventive and brilliant. And if you like world building, this is fantastic. But it's not a hard science book. But this is one of Aldis's best novels. And it was also, in the States, it was called The Long Afternoon of Earth. And I think as a series, it won the Hugo. It certainly won the Hugo. It might have won it as a series because it's a fix-up. But you wouldn't know it. It's absolutely brilliant. And this is the kind of thing that you can easily miss. And it should be in every science fiction library. Speaking of books which should be in every science fiction library, and most people haven't actually read, is Pierre Boulle's Planet of the Apes. Now, my original copy is a Penguin. It's an A format. It's got a film tie-in cover. I bought it in about 1974. And this is a Penguin classic from about 15 years ago. This is out of print now. It's now a vintage classic with a 3D cover with 3D glasses inside. But this is really nice. And this is one of my favourite SF novels. He's French, of course, and Pierre Boulle is more famous for writing the book The Bridge on the River Kwai, which is a World War II narrative, prison camp narrative, and that was filmed as really famous. Now, of course, Planet of the Apes has been filmed with many sequels, but the fact is there's nothing like the original novel, which is really, really something. He wrote other SF, but it never really worked, but this is great, and it is actually literally unfilmable. If you filmed this in exactly the way that it's told, because there's a frame narrative, the game would be given away straight away. But this is so clever and so charming, and I've read it probably a dozen or more times. I used to reread things a lot when I was growing up, when I was first reading SF, and I would go back to favourite books and really get to know the text really well, and I think it's fantastic. And in terms of the film versions, the first one is the most faithful and probably the best, but you've got to read this. And I bought a Folio Society one a while ago. Absolutely fantastic. Planet of the Apes. Used to be called Monkey Planet. The translation by Zan Fielding used to have Monkey Planet on the cover rather than Planet of the Apes. Who knows why? Then we have the William Burroughs cut-up trilogy, which I've talked about in another video, and they are SF, and here they are in the correct reading order, because they were published in a different order, which is The Soft Machine, Nova Express, and The Ticket That Exploded. There's a video about these on the channel, and you can read about them in my book 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels. So moving on, William Burroughs, of course, was one of the great inspirational figures for the new wave. People like Moorcock and Ballard absolutely loved him, and you should look into his work. It's very experimental and very important. Then we have a few more, and I've thrown in a black classic just to mix things up a bit. And this is a book I've talked about many times on the channel. I'm going to keep talking about it until you buy it. This edition is now to print. There's other editions in print. The one in America is published by New York Review of Books, and it's called The Stronghold. In the UK, it's published by Canongate, and it's called The Tartar Step. The Tartar Step. The Tartar Step is set in, I guess you could say, it's an alternate world, so it may be a fantasy. It's not really an SF novel as such, though there's nothing magical or supernatural happening in it. And it's the story of a young man with military ambitions who is sent on his first commission to a fort on the edge of a plain, hence the Tartar Step, waiting for the enemy to appear. And they don't even know if the enemy's really there. They think they are. They can't be seen. Occasionally there may be figures in the heat haze in the distance. And it's an absolutely amazing book. I absolutely love it. And it is one of the great books in the modernist canon. So if you like people like Camus, Hesse, Sartre, all those sort of guys, you should read this. Really, really quite something. Brilliant book. One of my favourite books of the last 25 years, which I've read in the last 25 years. It dates back to the late 30s. Then this is a book which, you know, to me, this is old hat. I mean, I've known about this book for decades, and there have been videos on YouTube about people just discovering it. And what it is, Alan Moore mentioned it at the end of one of his graphic novels, or halfway through, and I thought, oh, there you go. This is Margaret Cavendish's The Blazing World, which is a proto-SF novel. Margaret Cavendish was quite a well-off woman. She hated men, and it's kind of a feminist dystopia, and it dates back, gosh, it's 17th century, you know, it goes way, way back. And it's not really a great read, you know, it's one of those things which is interesting as a work of a feminist proto-SF. And there's all sorts of weird stuff going on. It's quite sort of ornate. But I don't think it's a major work really in any way, I have to say. It's important historically. And as I say, it's probably important for sort of feminist SF. And as a work of proto-SF by a woman is significant. So if you want to look out to do, it's interesting. It's worth a read, but I wouldn't say it's front rank. I say other people have made a video about it, you know, as if it's this great undiscovered thing. Well, it's not. It's just, it's been in print like forever. That's the thing. It's been in this Penguin Classics edition for, you know, at least 30, 40 years that I can think of. So there you go. So The Blazing World, early feminist dystopia. Then, of course, we have one of the great catastrophe novels, John Christopher, The Death of Grass. John Christopher, also known as Samuel Ude. And this current edition, as you see, has the mint green. And what's beautiful about this is the illustration from the hardcover first. So it's really nice to have that. Christopher is seen as a kind of like tougher alternative to John Wyndham, being more sparse and ripped down. And this is quite sort of a stark and harsh book. And the basic idea is very simple, very effective. A blight appears, which affects all forms of grass, all sorts of crops, so that includes rice. So all of a sudden, mankind has nothing to eat, and population is depleted. Things get very savage, and you know, it's kind of a survivalist tale. It's a virus rather than a blight, much the same thing, I would say. And it just follows this family across the country to a piece of land where there's a farm, and they think they might be able to survive. And it's kind of also a classic of sort of eco writing as well. People see it as being Sci-Fi, which is a term I can't stand, and it dates back to is it late 50s, I think it is. Let's see, 1956. It was published by Michael Joseph, who also published Wyndham, who he took off in the early 50s. And Christopher wrote several things like this, but for me, he's never quite got the same thing as Wyndham. He's probably tougher, but Wyndham has more of a literary feel. Wyndham is closer to Orwell or Wells than Christopher. Christopher's a little bit more stripped down, but it is well worth a read. There was a film, of course, called No Blade of Grass, which you never see very much, actually. I haven't seen it for years. Then something which, again, this is an out-of-print edition, I think. The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, which has got this wonderful American flag here, which is done in the style of one of the abstract expressionists. Is it Rauschenberg or Jasper Johns, I think, did a painting like this. Didn't have the swastikas, they're representing the States. And of course, The Man in the High Castle is the classic novel about Hitler wins and the Axis divide America up. The Japanese get the West Coast and the Nazis get the East Coast, and they're sort of going to kick off against each other at some point. And as Ursula Le Guin said, you know, this book contains the first Mrs. Brown in science fiction, Mr. Tagomi, an ordinary person. And it's a very strange book. I love it. I think it's really, really clever. The last page is incredible. I think a lot of people just don't get it. I don't think they get what is happening on the last page to Juliana Frink. I can't say because that would be a massive spoiler, but that was a huge revelation to me. And Philip K. Dick wrote this using the I Ching, the yarrow stalks. He would toss them to plot in. That's why it's so unconventional. And of course, it won the Hugo Award. Is it one of Dick's best novels? I think technically it is. It isn't one of my favourites. I wouldn't put it in my top 5, but I like it a lot. And it's interesting because if you read his mainstream novels, it has a lot of affinities with them. It's really good. And it's also partially based on a period in his life where he was, one of his wives, I can't think which one it was, I'm thinking it was Cleo, but I'm not certain, had a jewellery store, and she got him working for her making this jewellery. And there's sort of flashes of that in this, because in this West Coast, which is dominated by Japan, American folk art is quite collectible, and the Japanese colonists only want authentic Americana. They don't want anything new, they only want nostalgic things. And a couple of the characters, they try and start, you know, doing new American crafts, and there's all sorts of stuff in it. It's a great book, it really is. So there you go, that's The Man in the High Castle. There is a modern classics edition at the moment, but it's got a different cover to this, I seem to remember. I should know because I see it every day, but it's one of these ubiquitous books that just fades into the background because it's always there. Then we have a book which my original copy was of Picador, and I don't have any more. I wish I did, but his work got reissued in Penguin Modern Classics a few years ago. That's Russell Hoban, who's not always an easy read. He wrote all sorts of things: SF novels, children's books, children's book called The Mouse and His Child, which I read recently, which is really bizarre but wonderful. Also historical novels. And Ridley Walker is a post-apocalyptic novel. It's set sometime after nuclear war, and it's just really, really hard to describe because it's a polyglottal novel. It's written in phonetic speech. So the central character is speaking at you, but the spelling is all over the place because the language has become degraded, and England is broken down, and you find yourself trying to make sense of what he's saying and what's going on there, because the whole thing about nuclear war, and he talks about the little man in the atom, ADDOM, and you realise the little man in the atom, and it's all about this folk memory of how nuclear war came about and what the tech was and things. And Anthony Burgess loved it, and it is very challenging. It's not for everybody. I would say if you like Edgar Pangborn, if you like Davy particularly, you'd probably love this, but you do have to take your time with it. And it's kind of like one of the sort of James Joyce books of science fiction, but it's now in a absolutely beautiful Penguin Modern Classic. Look at that, isn't that gorgeous? So one to watch out for. There was a Masterworks hardcover, I think there still is, but the first is a Jonathan Cape one. And I remain divided about Hoban. He's one of those very, very unique voices. And sometimes I find him unreadable, other times I enjoy his work. He's akin in some ways to Alan Garner, but I find Alan Garner really annoying, and his characters never mesh with me, even though they are realistic. They're a certain type of person, and Garner for me never quite articulates in the way that I think, say, Nigel Neal would when it comes to the countryside, the landscape, and the strange and the odd, which Hoban does quite well in here. It's a very interesting writer. I urge you to check it out. If you like post-apocalyptic narratives, this is one of the most sophisticated of all of them. So now, I was saying a few minutes ago how you wouldn't get to see The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle, and I actually do have it. I didn't realise I had it. I thought I'd got rid of it. I've never really got on with this. This pops up all the time. It's probably his most famous novel, and it's about a strange black cloud which is spotted out in space, and it's coming towards Earth, and it begins to engulf the Earth. And in a way, it's rather like Solaris in a funny sort of way. It's not really like it, because there is a thing about alien intelligence, and that comes up a lot in Hoyle's work. I'm not a massive fan of his writing. My favourite book by him is October the 1st is Too Late. He falls somewhere between Colin Wilson at his clunkiest and John Christopher at his clunkiest. So he's sort of between the two. And I mean, Colin Wilson's a much, much better writer, but recently when I reread some Hoyle, it's more about the period, late 50s, early 60s. And Hoyle's a controversial figure because he was, royal astronomer. But a lot of the things he came up with, he was very big on panspermia, on the idea that Earth was seeded with life from outer space. He was also very big on the steady state theory, that there was never a big bang. And who knows, he may be right yet, but all the evidence at the moment is looking that way. It is one of those sort of duty reads, but I personally am not a huge fan of it. I don't find him that articulate. He can write, but there is this thing where the style isn't that great. I mean, if he could write, if this was a Bob Shaw book, it would be absolutely brilliant. He's not enough of a writer is the problem. He's too much of a scientist, I think. So again, I'm cheating by throwing in the odd black classic and mixing it up, because what you'll see about these books is the liveries are all slightly different, because Penguin Modern Classics has been going for so long, and because they change the liveries, you don't get a uniform look if you collect them over the years. Because one thing you should do is, if you're already familiar with Penguin Modern Classics, if they do something that you haven't seen before, and you're interested in the books generally, is buy them, because very often they don't get a second printing. Like, for example, the Tartar Step didn't get a second printing. They will sometimes license things, do them once, then they go out of print. And a classic example of this was going back about 10 years ago. They got the license for The Man Who Fell to Earth by Walter Tevis, which is one of my favourite books. And I still got my Pan original with David Bowie on the cover. And basically, they did it with a still from the film of The Man Who Fell to Earth, and I thought, oh, that's really nice, I should get that. And I didn't. It went out to print, and now it's gone back to Gollancz. So what can you do? So you do have to pick them up. So if you collect Penguin Modern Classics and are interested in the modernist canon, and you see one you haven't seen before, have a look at the printing history, and if you're interested at all, buy it, because it will probably disappear. The core of the list doesn't change and goes on and on and on and on. But we're actually going to look at a black classic here. This is, again, one of my favourite books of all time. It was the first adult novel I ever read. It was the first adult novel I ever bought my own money. It wasn't this copy. I've still got my copy. So John Murray. And this is The Lost World and Other Thrilling Tales. And as you see, there's a Brontosaurus on the cover. Of course, they call it an Apatosaurus now, don't they? And this still is from the 1925 Willis O'Brien animated film. That's stop frame animation of The Lost World. And it also contains The Poison Belt, which is also a Professor Challenger story, The Terror of Blue John Gap, and The Horror of the Heights, which is in like every anthology of of early SF you'll ever come across. If you have an anthology of SF between, say, Frankenstein in 1818 and 1925, when the pulp magazines just get going with Hugo Gernsback, basically Horror of the Heights is in all of them. It's a great story, it's a great story. But The Lost World, the classic dinosaur tale, the best dinosaur novel ever. It's very, very, very funny as well. And, as a kid, I didn't appreciate that, but I love it now. And it's about a young reporter who's got Irish blood called Malone, and he's a great big strapping lad, you know, he plays rugby and stuff and that, and he has this thing for this girl called Gladys, and she's bemoaning the fact that nobody's heroic anymore, and he really wants to capture her heart. So he ends up going on this quest, this mission, this expedition is the word I'm looking for, with Professor Challenger, who's a very bellicose big bloke who claims they're on a plateau in Latin America. They're living dinosaurs, and he can prove it. And his sparring partner, Professor Summerlee, who's more of a crusty old thin academic, says, no, Challenger, absolute nonsense. And the quartet of explorers is completed by a guy called Lord John Roxton, who's basically a big game hunter and classic sort of English, you know, moustache twiddler. And they go off and they find there are indeed dinosaurs, and it's a ripping yarn. And, you know, there have been some film versions, they're all crap. Apart from this first one, which is actually really, really good. If you've not seen the 1925 black and white Silent the Lost World, you should watch it. It's really great, and it's very, very funny. The characterization is brilliant. I mean, that's one thing Doyle was really good at. I never really got on with Sherlock Holmes, but I do love the Challenger story, so I guess I was born to be a science fiction reader. So that's The Lost World and Other Thrilling Tales. Is there currently a penguin of this? Probably, because it's out of copyright. There's probably 2 or 3 different penguins. I know there's a kids one. Everybody should read this. It's one of the great SF novels to appear between the beginning of the career of H.G. Wells and 1925-26, when the pulp magazines get going. Fantastic. Now, interestingly, this is a Penguin Mon classic, and as you see, it's got this sort of whitish grey, very subtle livery, which is rather like when you go for a tin of white paint and they can't sell you a tin of white paint. You've probably seen the advert. You can have eggshell blue or whatever, or you can have all these variants, but you can't just have white anymore. Now, this is interesting because this is Robert Graves' 7 Days in New Crete, as you can see. It's got a white spine. Now, if you see a penguin like this with no illustration on the cover, just plain, this is a modern classic, that's print on demand. Now, for a print on demand book, it's really, really good quality. And recently, last year, Penguin reissued a load of Robert Graves, including Count Belisarius, some short stories, various other things, The Golden Fleece, his account of Jason the Argonauts, which I hadn't seen. And you know, these books have been in print for a long, long, long time. And 7 Days in New Crete, which is his Utopian novel. Really great stuff. And so I snapped that up. I do have an old A format copy, but I absolutely love that. This is the plainness of this really does it for me. I know a lot of people hate these really plain, boring books, but I absolutely love them. I think that's fantastic. Christopher Priest, my old friend who died earlier this year, he just wanted his books to just have typography on the cover and no pictures, because it doesn't help sell them. But there you go. So if you see some of these, they print on demand, and you know, that's unusual because print on demand books are usually really bad quality, but Penguin of course do a proper job. Kudos to you, Pengies. Then a book that's been in Penguin for, you know, going way, way back to the 70s, is Harry Harrison's Make Room, Make Room. His finest novel, certainly the finest one I've read. I will make no claim to having read them all. There's a lot. I've read quite a few. His humorous books have never really resonated with me. He was a great guy, obviously, great editor, anthologist. I read the Stainless Steel Rat books when I was in my teens, and I was always disappointed by them. I think probably because I'd read Who Goes Here by Bob Shaw, which is similar ballpark, but actually much, much better. But this book, I love this book, Make Room, filmed, of course, as Soylent Green. And it's a bit of a thing to say if you're a hardcore SF fan that, oh, you know, Soylent Green's very sensationalistic, don't really like it, you know, and it doesn't sort of do justice to the book. But I think Soylent Green's really good. And I think the sensationalism was necessary. And I love Charlton Heston, and I love Edward G. Robinson in his final role, so moving. But basically, this was a polemical SF novel, it still is, about overpopulation. And it's set around about the year 2000, and the population has swelled, and people are living mostly in poverty. Money is really short, food is really short, and it's about a cop who has to investigate a murder case in a crowded New York. And Harrison was a great believer that overpopulation would be a problem. And, you know, obviously this book is set 25 years ago, but the fact is that even though they say that population is going to decline now over the next 50 years, perhaps the damage is already done. That's the thing, because it's our demand, because there's so many of us, it's the demand for stuff which has caused all the problems. And if only we'd heeded the warnings of the sort of anti-overpopulation people in the 50s and 60s, the world might not be so full of plastic and so full of people and so noisy. So this book has a place in my heart, and I read it probably when I was in my teens, and I was always very passionate about that issue as well. And it still stands up really well, and it's a very well written book. And as a picture of a dystopian society, it's not very SF-ish at all. It's just showing this crushing world of crowding and sweatiness and general horror, but it's just really well written. I absolutely love it. It's a great book. And again, there's a little A format version as well, but this one's still in print, and a great jacket that. And this is let's see, the white livery. The current livery is the mint green. Before that it was white, before that it was silver, and it just changes. Now there's orange at one point, changes all the time. Then at the moment I'm reading the classic English novel The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, which was published in 1953 and is set in the early part of the century, and I'm quite enjoying it. But at the same time, I have that feeling that I get about Evelyn Waugh. The writing's really good. It's not as good as Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh's writing is absolutely beautiful, but is it actually saying very much? And I get this with Kazuo Ishiguro as well, where a lot is made of something that's quite small. But there you go, we'll see how I get on with it. But anyway, this is Facial Justice, L.P. Hartley's SF novel. This came out in the late 50s, and the idea behind this is that this is about a society where people are not allowed to be too beautiful. If you're beautiful, then you seem to be doing other people down. And there's the character in this is called Jail 97, and she's an alpha, overprivileged for her beauty, and she is sent to the Ministry of Facial Justice, where her face will be reconstructed. So it's quite an interesting one, that in the age of TikTok and that sort of thing, where everybody's doing doing selfies and reels, all these beautiful girls doing reels of themselves, what have you. This is quite an interesting one. So this is also set after World War III, so it's got a post-apocalyptic narrative as well. I haven't read it yet, and I've been putting it off, and I hope that I get on with The Go-Between. I'm about 50 pages in, because otherwise it could put me off this. But I think this is an interesting one. I've never read it. I've had it here for a couple of years. I'll get around to it at some point. So there you go. These dystopian novels by people who don't come from a background of genre SF, they can be absolutely brilliant, because remember, that's Huxley, Orwell. They can also be very overrated, Margaret Atwood. So we'll see, I guess. When I read that, I'll let you know. I'll do a review of it. I might pick it up soon. We'll see how we go. Then a book I've mentioned on the channel a few times. It's a book which used to be really obscure. People like Brian Aldiss and Christopher Priest used to talk about it way back. And this is Ice by Anna Kavan. There are several editions of Ice in print now. This is actually an American black classic. Now, I'm not going to talk about Ice because it's in my video Top 10 Science Fiction Books to Read in Winter. It's quite a famous book now. It's no longer obscure. I first read it about 35 years ago. And this is a black classic, and this is an American one. Now, as I say, they don't have modern classics in America. So the whole idea of what goes into a classic fiction section in a bookshop is rather confused by the American black classics, because some of them are as recent as the 50s. This is a 1960s book. This was her last book before she died. And it's really bizarre, because you go to a classic session. We've got one in work, and there's the odd book in there which are American black classics, and they're from the 50s and 60s. And I'm always saying to the guys, we should pull that out. These are modern books. It's not of the same vintage of things like Dostoevsky and Thomas Hardy or what have you, but a great book. You should read it. And as I say, it's in my video Top 10 Science Fiction Books to Read in the Winter. There's also a video on the channel about Mercury, the quasi sequel to Ice, which hardly anybody's read except me, but that's good as well. Great stuff. Really interesting writer. Then we get on to somebody who Penguin has put some money into in the last few years, and they've reissued a load of his books, and that's Stanislaw Lem. Alongside Penguin, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also reissued some of his books, and I did a video about 2 years ago called The Problem of Knowledge, looking at Lem's books which are about first contact, things like The Invincible, Fiasco, Solaris, of course. Solaris is still published by Faber. Faber don't publish science fiction, you know, or so Toby Faber says in the recent book about Faber. He said, well, we used to, but we don't do it now, so we leave it out. Yeah, thanks for that. And the thing is that Faber, I just wish they'd do a proper job of it. They've got this paperback. It's high time there was a reissue in hardcover of Solaris, but they will not do it, and they're missing out because people would buy it. But anyway, on to the Penguin ones. Tales of Perks the Pilot. Very nice, I think you'll agree. And, you know, these are quite funny, really. Perks is a cosmonaut. And, you know, he does all sorts of bizarre things. They're quite knockabout. He confronts some typical sort of science fiction problem things. They almost feel in a way like parodies of the kind of thing that Asimov and Heinlein would have done. Those sort of problem stories that John W. Campbell was so keen on. And interestingly, on Perks's helmet there, you see there's a fly. So they're quite good fun. Lem, I like Lem, but I blow hot and cold because I think the major problem is that he's translated by about 98 million different people, so you don't get that smoothness. I've got an old King Penguin, which is a B format omnibus of Solaris, Chain of Chance and Perfect Vacuum. 3 very different books about very different things, and they're all by different translators, and you just don't get that commonality of feel. And I do think that's a real issue, I have to say. And here is a whole brace of Lems in the contemporary Penguin Modern Classics livery. This is my King Penguin, which I just talked about. And I bought this way back in, when was it? It would have been in 1984-85. And Solaris was my first Lem. Chain of Chance is like a kind of detective story. It's a very interesting book. It's very hard to describe. And then A Perfect Vacuum is like a series of reviews of books which don't exist. It's utterly bizarre. So it's very like sort of Borges type thing. I wish they'd redo these. And King Penguin initially had a different identity. And if you watch Jules Burt's videos, you'll get that. But King Penguin had become, by the late 70s, early 80s, had become a classic literary B format imprint designed to compete with Penguin. And the odd SF thing would pop up into it, like this, and another book I'll show you later on. But, you know, if you've not read Lem, Solaris is probably the best place to start. Classic first contact story. I wouldn't say start with A Perfect Vacuum. That's for the more advanced literary students, I would say. But what have we got here? The Siberiad is also available in a little A format as well, in the Penguin Classic Science Fiction A format series, which are orange and purple. The Futurological Congress. I've read this book 3 times, I think, and it's just absolutely nutty. It's totally knockabout. There's a film called The Congress, which is very loosely based on it, which is good in parts. The frame narrative of The Congress is really good. It then goes into an animated thing, which I'm not so keen on. Animation's not one of my things, I don't know why. But this is there's a character that Lem uses quite a lot called Ijon Tishi, and he's a bit like Perks the Pilot. He's basically a cosmonaut, and he gets sent out on all sorts of missions. And on this, he goes back to Earth, and he has to attend this conference, which is about futurology. And it's set in Latin America. Is it Brazil? I think it's Brazil. Costa Rica, rather. And he's in a luxury hotel with a load of scientists, and he has to attend these rather dull seminars, and all sorts of stuff starts to happen. He gets shot with an LSD dart and hallucinatory gases and stuff like that, and it's really knockabout. And you can see why he liked Philip K. Dick. And the last time I read this, it reminded me of The Unteleported Man, aka Lies Inc. Because when things get very strange in Lies Inc., the expanded, revised edition of The Unteleported Man, with the sort of trippy section, there's a real similarity there. Do I like it? Well, I've read it 3 times. I guess it tells you everything you need to know. Also available, The Star Diaries and Mortal Engines. They're beautiful, aren't they? Mortal Engines, of course, is a quotation. I can never remember who it's a quotation from, which is why it's been used so many times for titles. There's at least 2 or 3 kids' books called Mortal Engines. There's the Philip Reeve one. Is it Cassandra Clare? I can't remember. And my favourite of these, which is the very wonderful First Contact novel, Fiasco, which was his last novel. And I really think this is neglected, and I think it's brilliant. If you look back to my video, The Problem of Knowledge, about Lem, I talk about this a lot, and I would say it's better than The Invincible. It's more readable than His Master's Voice, which is very, very strange, but nonetheless excellent. And I would put it up there with Solaris. There was actually spikier. Absolutely brilliant. For me, this was kind of, he died at this sort of state-of-the-art stage, really. It's also a hard SF novel, so if you like Solaris and you like hard SF, this will really float your boat. And you know that whole thing that people do about philosophical science fiction videos, and they get hundreds of thousands of views? All good science fiction novels are philosophical. It's the nature of the beast. I mean, it's so obvious that, you know, any science fiction novel which isn't philosophical is a bad one. By the very point of it being SF, it becomes a philosophical novel. It's just a question of how philosophical. Very often that's what you read into it. Fiasco really does pose a lot of interesting issues about first contact. And if you like Blind Sight by Peter Watts, I really think you should read this. I think this is like the real thing, I must say. Blind Sight's probably sexier, you know, with the vampires and everything, and I do love that idea. But this is the one that really sort of stuck a needle in me, I have to say. Fiasco, Stanislaw Lem. Hardcore stuff. The beauty of an imprint like Penguin Modern Classics is that very often it affords them the opportunity to print books which are one-offs, where you get a writer who's just done one book which is outside their usual thing. As I say, often there's books by mainstream writers which happen to be SF. So, you know, it is worth watching out for them, as I say. And we'll just finish off with 4 sui generis works, really. They're sort of one-offs. And this is a King Penguin, and King Penguin is a defunct imprint. And this is Pavan by Keith Roberts. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more in an interview I'm doing with Richard Rempel at Vintage SF. By the time you see this, it might be up on Richard's channel. It probably won't be, so I'm going to not say too much about it. But Pavan, of course, is the classic alternative history book. And this is the King Penguin edition, which I bought way back in 84, 85. Let me just have a look. Let's see. First published in Impulse magazine, 66. And what date is this from? 1984 edition. So that was the first copy of Pavan. I've got about 4 or 5, and this is the first one. So this is the way the Penguin were trying to market their B format books at this point. Modern Classics was going into B format, but they were doing this to combat Picador, who were sort of the leaders in the literary market, because as I've said many times, back then most books were still in A format, and the B format was deemed to be the literary highbrow variant. So what else do we have? This is a black classic. I've thrown it in there simply because it's an important book. MP Shield, The Purple Cloud, which goes back, let me think, early 20th century, late 19th. I can't really recall. Let's have a look. See, 1901, Chaytor Windus, and it was in a magazine first, I think, and Mike Moorcock mentioned this, and Gollancz did a really nice hardcover of this, which was purple. I always wanted to pick one up, plain purple jacket, in their Gollancz fantasy series. And this is about, it's a last man narrative. A purple cloud descends and kills everybody apart from one guy. He was left on his own, and he gradually goes bonkers. He goes around looking for life on Earth, so see if there's anybody surviving. So in a way it's rather like Earth Abides and other narratives like that. The Quiet Earth sort of comes to mind as well. And it is quite purple. It's quite sort of 1901. It's quite powerful. But if you like sort of post-apocalyptic things, it's really great, you know. So it's one of those early British apocalyptic novels which everybody should have on the shelves if they're a skiffy fan. So there you go. And that's in the Penguin Classics, as you see in the Black Classics. Another one of those one-offs which came out not too long ago in Modern Classics, and this is the current livery, I say mint green, is R.C. Sherriff's The Hopkins manuscript. And R.C. Sherriff is best known for that play, which is a World War I, World War II play, which his title escapes me. If I was in work, I'd be fine, because I always have these things in my head in work. And let's have a look. It was... And Journey's End, of course it is, Journey's End. Getting old, you see. Journey's End, World War I play. He wrote other things, lots of screenplays, and the Hopkins manuscript is again a catastrophe novel, and it's sort of very English, and this is the manuscript left behind by a final survivor. And the idea in this is the moon is going to crash into the earth when worlds collide. So, you know, it's these hoary sort of SF concepts, but very interesting. Great jacket, I think you'll agree. And this goes in and out of print, so it's around now. But before this, I hadn't seen it in print for a really, really, really long time. In all the reference books, as they say, and an interesting oddity by a mainstream writer, best known for a drama. There you go, R.C. Sheriff, The Hopkins Manuscript, a classic English catastrophe novel. We're going to end with the very weird Vladimir Sorokin, who's a contemporary Russian writer, not very popular with Mr. Putin. This is The Blizzard. He's quite a cool looking guy. He looks like somebody, he looks like he should be in Popple Vuh, the krautrock band, doesn't he? And this, a doctor goes out in the middle of a snowstorm, and there's all sorts of bizarre creatures, and there's lots of references to other Russian literature. He's really hard to describe. He uses SF tropes a lot. They're usually satirical and saying something political about the contemporary scene in Russia. I don't know how the guy's still alive, to be honest. There's another one in Modern Classics which is called Day of the Oprichnik, which is set in a dystopian future, as if Russia wasn't dystopian enough for some people. And, you know, he's really sort of lauded in this, but he's quite difficult to read. He's one of these classic Russian guys who seems to draw on the fabulous tradition in Russian literature, on fairy tales and things. And, you know, Bulgakov did it, the Strugatsky brothers did it, and things like Snail on the Slope. They all seem to do it, you know, and Monday Begins on Saturday was another one. But they all seem to like mixing it up, mixing up the sort of SF tropes of dystopia and controlled societies, mixing them up with fabulous things. And it doesn't always work, may I have to say. But very, very beautiful, I think you'll agree. Isn't that gorgeous? So that's a look at Penguin Modern Classics science fiction with a few black classics and some old King Penguins thrown in. Just to give you the idea that, as I say, when you go in a bookshop, if you just go to the science fiction section all the time, you're going to miss a lot of good stuff. And it's hard because you just look through everything. But if you look at some Penguin Modern Classics and watch out for names you don't know, then you might discover something very special indeed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.